predictability of the macro environment, which the professor was talking about, is so important because large projects require a period of time to develop. If you have a lot of volatility in the market over a period of, say, 5 years to develop several thousand houses, then it means the entire economic proposition of that project becomes questionable. And it makes it very difficult for somebody like OPIC to provide financing, let alone for a developer to deliver low margin product at scale over a large period of time. So recognizing that we're asking developers to produce housing at a relatively low margin at scale means that we really do need a stable environment for those delivery mechanisms as we can possibly provide. We recognize that municipalities, which are usually responsible for providing the primary infrastructure, the power and the water and the waste treatment facilities and the primary roads, don't have the financing. They don't have the capacity to do that in many cases. OPIC is trying to look at ways that we can support either through some kind of municipal bond programs. There's a group called MIDA that's working on that. USAID is involved in some municipal bond financing for infrastructure. But we are looking at on a project-by-project basis whether there is a way that we can structure an infrastructure tranche, so to speak, along with the delivery of the housing itself. We recognize that it's a challenge. And it does require some capital, some thinking about the equity capital side of the equation, and we can talk about that more during the Q&A. I would say the other issue that we have had is that we really do need companies who are skilled at delivering housing at scale, and there aren't very many. On the African continent, there just aren't very many. Now, there are a few here this week. There are a few companies, and I hope you get to meet them. We're hoping that we can work with them. So the the thing that I have in my mind here is find a company that's accustomed to delivering large-scale projects, maybe not housing, but some other type of real estate development, and encourage and incentivize those companies to move into the affordable sector. OPIC can provide financing for a development project up to maybe 7 or 8 years that would allow us to deliver several thousand houses over that period of time. We can do that. We normally need to do it in phases because if you have a $100 million project, most of the time, the average developer isn't going to be able to come to the table with the equity that we would normally require for a project like that. For a $100 million project, we're going to finance about 65 million. So that means the sponsors have to come up with a big chunk of equity to make that work. So what we normally do is we'll normally structure a large-scale project in phases. This was our first foray into relatively large-scale project finance. It's in Honduras. This was targeted to bottom of the pyramid. These were people making somewhere around $150 to $200 a month. They were factory workers primarily. A few self-employed, informal worker type folks. There was no mortgage program in Honduras, so we had to design a product where we facilitated the construction of the houses. So we dispersed money during construction, and then that rolled into a lease-to-own financing program. So it was a 25-year term. It was actually dollar denominated, which was problematic. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it provided actually a very low monthly payment for the buyers. It was about $75 a month. The houses were very simple, maybe 40 square meters, 2 little bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and then a common kitchen living space. Basic concrete. The roofs were an aluminum tin kind of combination. So, it turned out to be a great little community. It was built for 3,500 houses, but they designed it in small little micro communities. Each one had its own gate. So each little community had a name, it had a gate, it had its own little play area, and even though they look pretty cookie cutter here, it allowed each of those communities to kind of develop their own little mini neighborhoods. The developers negotiated with the municipality to bring a school onto the site. They had full security, which was extremely important. Choloma Valley is a very dangerous neighborhood. The environment behind the security walls in this location was safe. It allowed people to thrive. The problem is that a very low-income family was just not comfortable they didn't understand 25-year financing and that they were actually going to own this house by the time the 25 years of payments were made. So it essentially turned into a rental project. The developer did not anticipate all of the work that was going to be required to manage this community. The people in the community didn't understand how to work together to take care of maintenance, to maintain the security, to keep the school going, to maintain relationships with the municipality. So the developer actually had to continue to work with them over a period of years, and God bless them, they did it because they cared. But that's not something the average developer of housing would do today. And it is something that we're finding needs to be done in order to support low-income housing. You need partnerships between the commercial developers and some kind of community agency that really does understand the families and the community needs and is able to facilitate that relationship. So, our strategy at this point is we want to find high-quality developers. I think there's an opportunity for us to work with smaller developers and help build them up to the point that we're working with OPIC, but frankly, for large-scale projects, we need established companies. And part of that is because of the equity requirements that you'll see shortly and other things like completion guarantees. I do encourage, though, collaboration among larger development companies and smaller ones so that you create this mentoring system where gradually you increase the capacity of the affordable housing industry as a whole. We're interested in catalyzing local sources of long-term funding. OPIC can provide hundreds of millions of dollars of debt. We can do that, but right now that's dollars. And the exchange risk associated with that over the long term is problematic. For a couple of years, you might be able to manage it. But what we're trying to do is figure out ways that we can use our guarantee authority or somehow collaborate with local financial institutions to scale up their capacity with mixed funding, dollars and local currency. So we're looking for the land to be tied up, as I mentioned earlier. We're looking for equity raise, or at least preliminary indications that you can raise 30 to 40% of the project costs. For the first phase, normally what will happen is you build the first phase, you sell the houses, and you generate cash flow, which is then reinvested in subsequent phases. So it becomes a rolling credit facility, if you will. And that reduces the amount of debt carry, and it reduces the amount of initial equity capital that's needed. We want everything to be sustainable. IFC Edge, we want it to be green. We want you to use sustainable building materials. We want to see, play areas. We want to see access to transportation, access to jobs, schools, clinics. It needs to be a comprehensive community. We're really pushing now for urban infill development, higher density projects, for example. How you make those livable and appealing to people who are accustomed to living, out in with open land is a challenge, no question about it, but I think we're up for it. I think there is expertise out there to help us do that. So we can't compete with local banks, we can't compete with local funding. We want to be complementary. So if you come to OPIC, you should have done your homework and be able to tell us, look, I cannot get a local bank to finance my project. That's why we're coming to you. And then this whole issue of accessibility, we're definitely no longer in the business of doing sprawl. Peri-urban sprawl, that's no longer a thing. It's not worked in most places. So if that's the kind of project you have in mind, we probably would not be interested. All right, so leverage we talked about. Collateral, we will take a mortgage on the land. You'll probably have a special purpose company to carry out the project. We'll take a pledge of shares. We will take assignment of bank accounts. Your contracts, all of your construction contracts would be assigned to us. We'll have debt service reserve. So if all of this is looking scary, then maybe OPIC isn't the right source. I will say that dealing directly with OPIC is complicated, but there are ways that we can funnel OPIC money through local sources, local entities that can then downstream that to smaller companies. So we really are looking at ways that we can more efficiently get funding out to a wider variety of smaller companies and look for ways that we can help bring up the capacity of those companies to meet the standards that OPIC or frankly any development bank is going to require. We're also working in the mortgage space, so we can provide financing for mortgages. We can provide guarantees for loans and guarantees for mortgage instruments. And this is something that we're actively looking at in Africa generally, in different parts of Africa. And I think that this is maybe the best place for OPIC to be directly involved, because essentially we bootstrap the demand side of the equation.